So the subject today is Leonard Woolf, born 1880, passed away in 1969. Important to Sri Lankan literature classrooms as the author of The Village in the Jungle, which he published shortly after his return to England after spending 7 years in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, from 1904 to 1911. He was a member of the Ceylon Civil Service at the time. This was more or less his first appointment coming out of university. He studied at Cambridge, and then he arrived in Ceylon. He served first in Jaffna, and gradually kind of came southwards, had a spell in Kandy, central part, and then the deep south in Hambantota. Actually, to the Sri Lankan imagination, it's Woolf's years spent in Hambantota that is closest. This is largely because of two reasons. Number one, Woolf's diary of his Hambantota days, especially 1906, 1908, which was published as a Thisara publication. This is still widely available in bookshops. And then, of course, The Village in the Jungle, because the feeling is the construction of that universe, which we find in the novel in Village in the Jungle, is largely based on Woolf's own first-hand experiences, moving about the people, the rural population of the Deep South, Hambantota included, because he was reporting to the government agent of that district. He was more or less a deputy. So, in that capacity, Woolf was very much at the ground level, meeting people, settling disputes at the local level, looking into their welfare, so on and so forth. Now, in this interaction, I wish to address one central question, and this is something that has periodically kept coming up in relation to Woolf's writing, and in terms of interactions I have had with people who deal with this kind of literary discourse, the kind of research articles I have had the opportunity of going through. Some of these are widely available in libraries. Some of them are there in scan, upload / PDF versions in online spaces. But also based on things I have heard in conferences I have attended from time to time. The issue I want to address is whether Leonard Woolf, in his mapping of Ceylon, in the way he looks at the local community, in the way he tries to understand the culture and the landscape, whether he is colonialist. That's number one. And number two, whether the kind of lens through which he accesses all these factors, whether it is an orientalist lens. So is Leonard Woolf a colonialist? Is he orientalist? Because scholarship, well, at least produced in Sri Lanka, scholarly opinion, I shouldn't say scholarship, scholarly opinion, this is, in addition to being documented or touched on in research papers, this is more a kind of an opinion people carry. So this is something that I have come across very often in casual conversation with people who are interested in this kind of literature. But it has a very firm conclusion that, in fact, Leonard Woolf is colonialist, and the kind of view, the kind of gaze that he unleashes on Ceylon and its people, it is an orientalist view. Now, I want to modify this a bit. I'm not very comfortable with this view, especially in the vicinity of some of Woolf's other work, including some of his short stories, but more importantly, Woolf's autobiographical writing. So by autobiographical writing, I mean his memoirs as well as letters Leonard Woolf has written, especially the time he was living in Ceylon, the kind of correspondences he has had with his family and his friends living in England. So I suggest that if you extend your reference scope to include some of Woolf's later writing, autobiographical work, his memoirs, his letters, as well as some sources other than The Village in the Jungle, like several short stories I would like to familiarize in this interaction, in the course of this interaction, we would have enough reason to modify a concrete claim that he is in fact orientalist, that Leonard Woolf is in fact looking at Ceylon through a colonialist gaze. So Leonard Woolf is of Jewish background, comes from a Jewish family, born in 1880, passed away in 1969. As I mentioned earlier, Ceylon was his first stop after a very vibrant and idealistic university career. He was at Cambridge, Trinity College, Cambridge, where he was with a few people with whom he forged a lifelong friendship, and who in their respective fields rose to be iconic figures of that generation. People like Lytton Strachey, for example, J.M. Keynes, the economics guy, and of course E.M. Foster. Some of them later set up the Bloomsbury Circle, a very close-knit literary, artistic, philosophical group of people in which Leonard Woolf and his wife Virginia were also leading figures. Now, Woolf's life spent in Ceylon is important to any discussion of his literary work created then and after. So one criticism is that Woolf sometimes tends to reduce some of these characters in subhuman terms, dehumanizing them in the way he sets them or localizes them in those harsh surroundings. Now, this is a claim which I think is not fair to be splashed with a label of orientalization or being colonialist just because the description goes that way. Because this might be just one page or 2 pages of a very large body of work. So this is actually something like looking at the BA, the outcome of a bachelor's degree of a person who would then go on to accumulate perhaps a postgraduate qualification or even a PhD, and basing our judgment on that person's ability on that very first, the original qualification. Or at least I would go further to say that, making a very big claim about Woolf based on some of his descriptions is like judging the academic acumen of a person based on a first semester assignment. So I think what I suggest is we have to go beyond that Especially we have to incorporate in our reading the autobiographical writing, which brings Woolf the person quite centrally within the narrative. Because let us not forget, The Village in the Jungle being a novel, and Woolf being just an author who sits outside the frame of that novel. We can't guarantee to what degree the writer intends to bring his own self, his own judgment, his own the spirit that moves his understanding and his immersion with the world into that text. So fine, you take that and you analyze that, but you offset it, or you set it adjacent to some other writing which can be of a better leverage to how we read the actual impulse with which this writer, in our case Woolf, tried to connect to the world surrounding. So in my understanding, the moment you go beyond the first few pages of The Village in the Jungle, the moment you take up, say for example, a book like Woolf's a memoir set in Sri Lanka, which was published in 1968. It's titled Growing. Growing is the part of his continuing autobiography memoir series, which focuses on the years 1904 and 1911. So the moment you take something like that, and then also when you familiarize yourself with some of his short fiction, like for example, A Tale Told by Moonlight. Then you have stories like Pearls and the Swine, mainly those two. There's another story called The Two Brahmins. There are many places in these stories that give us ample hints as to what kind of person Woolf was and how he understands the colonial situation. So, in my opinion, Woolf was actually a subject within empire, and he was reacting against empire and imperialism, trying to dig deep, and at a certain level, even creating a counter consciousness to how imperialism, channeled through empire, was working in places like Ceylon. So I would say at this place that Leonard Woolf can actually be placed akin to someone like E.M. Foster. E.M. Foster's response to the Indian condition, sometimes brought out in his own personal writing, as well as in books like The Hill of Devi and A Passage to India. These are the more popular works. And of course, the later George Orwell, especially George Orwell after 1935. So I would say these three writers can be set in conference as agents but also subjects of empire who, while occupying, a colonial space within their own capacity, they're actually reacting to empire and imperialism. Now, one early indication to this can be found in a series of non-fictional work Woolf publishes in the 1920s, largely between 1920 and 1928, especially in titles like Economic Imperialism, published in 1920, which was followed by uh, Empire and Commerce in Africa. So these are works that emerge out of an understanding of the deeper underpinnings of colonialism and empire, and how they operate as centralizing, as undermining forces of those colonial people and cultures. Okay, so the short stories. A Tale Told by Moonlight. Now, this is a familiar story, the plot of A Tale Told by Moonlight. This is set in Colombo. The story unfolds as a group of people lying on a field under a moonlit night, and someone volunteers to tell a story. So it's a bit like the beginning of Heart of Darkness. Uh, the story within story element is there, and the guy who starts telling the story, I think his name is Jessup, if I remember right. I might be mistaken. So the story Jessup tells deals with someone who had arrived in Ceylon from Britain, a colonial officer, let's say, and who had developed a romantic relationship with a local woman, a Sinhalese woman called Celestina Hami. So Celestina Hami, I think uh, this colonial officer meets Celestina Hami for the first time in a pub or a public house in Colombo. They fall in love. They move in together, and at some point, he actually sets up a beautiful bungalow in which the two of them are domiciled. And then at one point, the British colonial officer has to leave Ceylon. And the story ends with Celestina Hami's body being discovered floating on the water close to the seashore. So there is a question mark, but the implication is that she took her life, that she killed herself. So now this sounds very familiar because this is not even a stone's throw from this popular legend or folk tale concerning what's her name, Lovina Aponsua, who apparently was the lover of the second governor, British governor in Ceylon, Thomas Maitland. So when Thomas Maitland came here to Ceylon and met Lovina Aponsua, apparently he set up this wonderful mansion. As legend has it, that is the current Mount Lavinia Hotel, and that part of the outer Colombo suburb, Galkissa, right? So Galkissa becomes Mount Lavinia in homage to Lovina. Mohanraj Madawala has written a historical novel in Sinhalese, kind of purchased on this legend. So the way he kind of even basing his story on a folk tale or most probably a legend that he hears, it's a way of connecting with the world around him, trying to make sense of it, appreciating that world, and trying to be in synchronization with it. So these are indications as to the kind of connection Woolf was, the cultural connection he was aiming at, he was seeking to establish. Then, of course, the story Pearls and Swine. The Pearls and Swine happens it happens in Britain, in England. It's one of those clubs, exclusive clubs, members only kind of clubs. And there are two people probably spent a few years in India and have returned, and now they are discussing India in those the actual cliched reductive terms. These two people are having a very casual conversation. There's a third party in the vicinity who overhears what's been discussed, and he doesn't like this kind of trivialization, this kind of reduction. Then the third person intervenes at one point, and he kind of expresses his displeasure. He violently intervenes, and he says he himself has been in India for so long, and India can't be summarized like this over a cup of tea. That culture can't be packed into this kind of discussion. And he kind of he gives a Tamil proverb which indicates that, look, if you can do this, if you can narrow it down in this way, pack it into easy consumption, you're a swine. He says something like Kasimudal Rameswaram Varayil Terindavan, which kind of indicates between Benares and Rameswaram there is so much land, right? Which you cannot know for sure. This for me is the kind of motto through which I would like to look at Leonard Woolf and the way he responded to that colonial climate, and how he works against empire, which tries to, in different ways, maneuver, put into neat little shapes these vast people, the extensive culture and lifestyles which have their own rhythm and dynamic. So I would leave one more lead for people to actually go out there, and if you're interested, check this out. This comes in Woolf's Growing. It is a reference to pearl fisheries in Ceylon or Sri Lanka at the turn of the century. So this is towards the Mana area, Marichikaddi, where the government had the monopoly, and every harvesting season, the colonial government would issue a notice, and in responding to that, people in pearl fishery would come to Marichikaddi from across the Red Sea. So there would be Arabian traders, traders from Tamil Nadu, from India, people coming from the island itself, Ceylon. And for a 90-day period, they would carry out harvesting in that Marichikaddi area, which was, for purposes of pearl fishery, an artificially set town for that time period. So an entire town would be built, an ad hoc town, just for that 90-day period, and then it would be later dismantled. So actually, one of Woolf's very early experiences in Ceylon was being appointed to monitor the harvesting happening there. So according to the regulations at the time, you can harvest, and 1/3 of the harvest is given to the colonial government. 2/3 can be taken by individual companies. So one last note to add up to everything I have discussed. My suggestion that Woolf is someone contrary to the isolated descriptions you find in Village in the Jungle, that he is someone who operated with a deeper consciousness, that tried to understand, tried to connect with, tried to appraise local culture, local people. Then at another level, that he was actually reacting against empire, that he was also conscious of his position as a subject of empire, and that he was quite intelligent in understanding the larger maneuvers of the imperial project. Now, just to drive that point home, and as a final point, I would like to tell you three outstanding things that Woolf did in his limited capacity as a deputy to the government agent in Hambantota. Now, apparently, Leonard Woolf has been instrumental in introducing metal plows to people engaged in agriculture in the Hambantota area. Metal plowing, metal plows. So his idea was that these would be long-lasting, but it is also mentioned that the people were apparently they were not ready to change too easily from their archaic practices. That 2 or 3 years into the introduction, the metal plows were collecting rust somewhere on the side. But it's a good move on Woolf's part. And then also, secondly, he had tried to move the government agent to allocate provisions to set up a rest house for pilgrims who used to come to Kataragama from different parts of the island. And maybe as a result of that negotiation falling through, apparently Woolf had written to the colonial office petitioning against the government agent, his immediate superior. So I would say Woolf actually had something for the people at heart, and he tried to definitely operate at a level bigger than what we give him credit for in some of the essays we write about Leonard Woolf 100 years later.